Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Chris for that introduction. Steve and I would both like to say a sincere thanks to everyone involved in our invitation to come here. Our thanks to everyone who's been involved in organizing the visit. Our thanks to everyone who's made us feel so welcome here. And of course, our sincere thanks to you for turning out on this morning and being here. We hope after all the work that's been done so far, you are not feeling too conferenced out. It's a state that one gets into at this point. We'd like to begin by assuring you that we do not come here with any theories which we think that you ought to apply. We come here with stories of our own experiences in professional development, our thoughts and ideas arising from our experiences in the professional development of others, which we've been fortunate enough to be involved in. We are sincerely humbled by the thought that some of our experiences and our telling of them might be useful to some of you, and we hope that they are. Steve and I have been working together in various ways for around 20 years now, and as we continue our learning, it's true, of course, that our stories are at different stages. Steve's continuing learning and his discoveries take place in the bright light of the afternoon, as it were, as he moves on to new experiences and new projects and more research and more professional development. The stage of my own story is more in the twilight of evening, and some of the discoveries that I find myself making enlighten action that I will probably never go on to be involved in. And you may hear those different resonances in the stories that we tell. The way we'd like to play this then is that I'm now going to hand over to Steve for the first part of our presentation, and then it'll come back to me for the second part, and Steve will close the session down. The PowerPoint slides that you see will all be available on the British Council website for you afterwards, as will the resources that we refer to during the talk. And as Chris has already mentioned, there will be a question and answer session in room 104 at 12 o'clock. So at this point in this continuing succession of handing overs, I'm going to hand over to my friend and colleague, Steve Mann. Thanks.
Good morning. Have I got something interesting to tell you? 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 The one voice of action, confidence. The swashbuckling hero. The other voice, the introspective, doubting, puzzling, reflective voice. I'm going to talk to you today about innovation. What do we mean by innovation? For me, it's tied up with the idea of reflective practice, and a lot of you in some really stimulating sessions here at the wonderful TEC14 conference have been talking in interesting ways about reflection. I'm going to touch on what do we mean by innovation in relation to technology and materials. And then finally, I'll talk about practicing what we preach, because as teacher educators, I think we should at least occasionally do what we ask our teacher trainees to do. The British Council, I think, has done a lot to be at the forefront of innovation. They have the wonderful Elton Awards, which is the nearest that our industry gets to the Oscars, with a red carpet and awards and razzmatazz. I'm hopeful that one day I might do something to warrant one of those awards. At the moment, I feel lucky that I've been able to contribute to the the British Council Innovation Series, but more than anything, I feel lucky to be able to share the stage today with Julian, who, as he said, we've worked together for 20 years now. We're both rats. By that I mean the Chinese calendar, we're 12 years apart. I'm hopeful that you can tell which one of us is the younger one. But we've been working together, I think, for a long time, and he's very much my Guruji. Although, having said that, he's also taught me, I think, the suspicion of the idea of gurus. But as I say, I've learnt a lot from working with Julian. I'm very grateful, and it's a great honor for me to share the stage with him. He's taught me the values of John Dewey, Carl Rogers, the idea that it's worth sometimes trying to understand before telling people what you think. The idea that we ought to think about what's appropriate methodology to context. He introduced me to the writings of Prabhu, the idea that there's no best method, that we better have a look at context before deciding what is the best thing to do. And that's very much the topic today in terms of innovation. So we ought to ask ourselves, how successful have these innovations been in ELT? And Martin Waddell, who I think has written very well on this topic, says that although there's been a lot of ELT innovation, a lot of it has been unsuccessful because it doesn't take into account lessons from innovation theory. And perhaps the most important lesson from innovation theory, and it's something I've heard a lot of you talking about, is the idea that we should look at context. And Heinrichson's hybrid model looks at identifying contextual factors which are likely to hinder or facilitate the change process. And Adrian Holiday, again in that tradition of Prabhu, has talked about the importance of understanding context through detailed ethno-methodological understanding. What is the innovation situation? And this is very important, I think, in the publication that Chris waved to you, that in selecting the papers for that publication, we were committed to the idea of new in context. In other words, an innovation in Senegal will not be the same as an innovation in America. The innovation, what counts as an innovation in one context is very different. But more importantly for us, the idea of innovation demands concentration on process. Thinking about how we teach or train as much as which topics get covered, or the tools that we employ. So in writing and curating this edited collection, we wanted the contributors to make clear the steps, the things that they did in the introduction and implementation, evaluation of their projects, because for us it's the realization of an idea in action that constitutes what we would call genuine innovation. So, I think we're committed, and the writers in this edited collection are committed to the idea that moving away from best practice to praxis, and as we all know, we live in a post-method condition where we can't really rely on a new method coming along which is going to answer all our prayers, solve all our problems. Where we are is in this situation where we need a renewed recognition of the importance of situated learning and appropriate methodology. And I think that although reflective practice has been around for a long time, its values are still really important in a bottom-up, context-led process where teachers are at the center of deciding what is appropriate in terms of innovation. So I think that reflective practice should be taught on pre-service programs, in-service programs, but perhaps in a more systematic way. And again, I'd say that some of the sessions that I've been to at this conference would suggest that people here are beginning to look at reflective practice in perhaps a more data-led way, rather than just talking about theories and levels, but actually looking at examples of practitioners using reflection. So something that I've been working on with Steve Walsh at Newcastle University is trying to develop tools which are flexible for teachers to use in their context. For me, and I did spend some time in Japan, the concept of Kaizen is quite helpful. It's difficult to translate, but it means something like to make better. And when Toyota came to Britain, some people were surprised because British workers are quite lazy and they don't do what they're told. And when I was a student, I worked in a factory, and there was a clear division between the managers. They sat on one side of the canteen with nice tablecloths, glasses of wine, and I was a student, but I sat on the other side with the workers with plastic tables, cups of tea, very different food. There was a marked division between management and the workers. But Toyota in Sunderland introduced this idea of Kaizen, and they found that British workers weren't so lazy if you involved them in the production line, that if you listen to their ideas about how that model might be improved. So I think the Kaizen system can tell us something about reflective practice and ongoing appropriate methodology, because it's based on small changes rather than radical changes. In Vanessa Lee's session yesterday, somebody said, evolution, not revolution. And I think the important thing is that maybe ideas come from teachers and students themselves, and we ought to pay more attention to those. And this is a process of getting the workers, in the case of the Toyota factory, in our case teachers, to take ownership of their work and think about improvements. But again, as Vanessa Lee has said in another session, we need a reflective culture. We need a learning culture where that can happen. That's not so easy. At this point, I want to tell you a few secrets about reflective practice. I have 3 secrets about reflective practice, and I'm going to share them with you today. I want you to look at this picture. This is Julie. She's a very good reflective practitioner. And rule number 1 with reflective practice, get yourself away on your own, somewhere quiet. Rule number 2, go to the seaside. This is the best place for reflective practice. Rule number 3, and you have to look at the 2 pictures together, what do you see? What is the connection between these 2 people? They've both got their head on their hands. So remember, the 3rd rule, if you want to do reflective practice, make sure your head is sitting on your hand like that. So follow those 3 rules and you will be able to reflect. Of course, I'm not being serious. I hope there aren't people in the audience that are writing these 3 secrets down and going to tell other people about them. There may be 1 or 2, so let me be very clear, I was joking. Julian has written a very interesting book called The Reflective Practitioner in TESOL. I may have got the title slightly wrong, he can correct that later. But it's about reflective practice and about his journey and what he's been doing over the years. And again, it's been very influential on me. And I want to share with you the central metaphor of his most recent book. Does anybody know who this is? It's Narcissus. This is Narcissus, a reflective practitioner perhaps, looking in the mirror. We've heard a lot about mirrors. What happens to Narcissus with all this reflection? He dies. Rule number 4, too much reflexive practitioner, you might die. Here's another character who comes to a watery end, who also dies. This is our man of action. Narcissus is the reflective practitioner, the voice of doubt. Icarus is our man of action. He also dies. 2 metaphors for our human condition: action and reflection. And as Julian says, they are often seen just as failures, but we can usefully see them as the two aspects of who we are, of action and reflection. And we have to remember that Icarus did fly. He took risks. He took himself right to the point that he could go no further. And that, I think, tells us something. Icarus had wings. He flew higher than he should. Narcissus stayed down, about what that means for us. At this point, I think I'm going to have to go and get my backup copy. Teachers, how they might use various tools, various ideas. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the internet and from sites like Russell's in terms of seeing how we use particular tools. The last point I want to make very quickly before I hand over to Julian, and best of luck, Julian, with completing the rest of the presentation without PowerPoint slides. But the last thing I'd like to say before I leave you is that as teacher educators, I think we occasionally need to practice what we preach. And in my case, I've been trying to work with Russell on, it's back again. Good, okay. We're going through very quickly now. This is a little reminder of all the things that I've said. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll go back to materials very quickly, and I'd like to ask you whether you thought at the time this was a great innovation. I'm indebted to John Gray for this slide. What do we have on this page? We have a David Beckham lookalike. Two people lounged around on a sofa, but not very much English on the page. Was that really an innovation? Where did the innovation come from? You don't have to buy into full-scale neoliberalism to worry about the celebrity culture, capitalist values which are inherent in this kind of material. So I did tell you about Jane and Dave and their co-build series, and here's a quote from Scott Thornbury, which I'll read to you. It was perhaps the absence of, and that should be covert, grammatical labels, along with the innovative task design approach, which scared off potential converters, and which accounts for the fact that Colin's co-build English course was less than a runaway success. One can't help regretting that this was a case in a market where publishers are conspicuously reluctant to back innovation. The failure of a project so brave and so principled was the publishing equivalent of the Titanic going down. There's Russell Stannard's website, and I'd recommend you go and have a look at some of the tools which he recommends that teachers can innovate with. And I think we need to make more use of screen capture software in showing teachers how to use tools. I'm not going to take up any more time by following that link because I'll not leave Julian too much time. But I'll finish with this quote from Jenny Moon, which is, I think, important to both of us. While teacher educators promote reflection among teachers, they seem to have less tendency to consider reflection as a method for their own practice. And I think we should all remember that from time to time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. I didn't know Steve was going to say such kind things about me. It's very moving to hear them. Thank you. It's always been a pleasure to work with him. I didn't intend to talk myself about the Narcissus and Icarus myths, but as Steve has raised them, let me make a link with that, because it was the great Indian physicist Chandrasekhar who who said of his mentor, Rutherford, he used to come into the lab in the morning and he would say, "Let's see how high we can fly before the sun melts the wax in our wings." And I think that's the principle that's being referred to there in terms of continuing development. It's a part of what makes us human. Now, moving along, when I was gathering my thoughts for this visit, I opened up a few old files, and in one of them I found the first issue of a newsletter entitled Foretell from 1991. The newsletter came out at the time of my previous visit here to Hyderabad and referred to an earlier trip of mine in 1989. And I read that my contribution to this newsletter took the form of an encouragement to teachers to communicate and share with each other and share their own practices as a way of moving forward. I'm going to move because I can't actually see my slides on this machine here, so I don't know what's up there. It says you have to get no microphone. Sorry. We also, I need that microphone. There's no slide.
1, 2.
We have to get beyond our isolated individual experiences. One way forward as teachers must surely be to meet and talk about our teaching, and then to trust each other enough to visit each other's classes, and then to talk and plan some more. And that was, I think, in tune with work that was being done here that we heard about yesterday in Rama Matthew's plenary. Soon afterwards, I remember being greatly encouraged by an article published in ELTJ by Naidu et al. The authors reported on a more sophisticated version of just such an approach, taken by colleagues, all of whom had experience of teaching classes of more than 100 students. In the article, they emphasized the importance of articulating to each other what they actually did in class. And on this, they said, we also see that we are but identifying what we already do intuitively. But by naming what we do, we have recovered our practice, which otherwise might have been lost irretrievably. A fate we believe that many teachers have suffered. Further, we can now identify for ourselves what aspects of our practice we are confident of and what we need to strengthen. Okay, can we go back to those mics again, please? I find those words, a fate that we believe many teachers have suffered, to be among the most hauntingly resonant ever written in the field, and as relevant now as they were then, as teachers are still encouraged to believe that their job is somehow to apply theories, or so-called theories, developed by people elsewhere. As Kumaravadivelu puts it, since the audiolingualism of the 1940s, TESOL has seen one method after another roll out of Western universities and through Western publishing houses to spread out all over the world. On each occasion, teachers in other countries and other cultures have been assured that this one is the correct one, and that their role is to adapt it to their learners, or to adapt their learners to it. And while reading the work of Naidu et al., I hoped at the time that this fundamental principle of action research or of reflective practice, and we can discuss the difference between them later if anyone wants to, namely that we begin by observing and learning from what we already do, that this view was about to take over our field, but the passage of time has shown that I was too optimistic or perhaps too naive. However, in order not to be too dismissive of the gains that have been made, I think it is fair to say that the dominant discourse of theory followed by application has been made to give some ground. And again, we heard details of this in Rama Matthew's plenary yesterday. Bless you. For my own part, I have been trying to work along these lines ever since. And the title of my 2009 book, written with Sue Garton, Moving from Experience to Knowledge, was meant to point in this direction. And because experience and knowledge are located in place and in time and in people, I think this leads us to one single truth. And the one single truth is that there is no single truth. As language teachers, as teacher educators, as language teachers, as teacher educators, we can only continue to search for momentary, located ways that bring together the learning potential that is, on the one hand, rooted in our common humanity, and on the other hand, rooted in social and cultural difference. And then just as we make this point, we necessarily throw open another window on our activities, providing a broader view, a view that insists that we take into account the varying contexts of our professional activities and the motivations that arise from those contexts. Some of the reflections that I'm going to go on to express now may once have sounded provocative, but I hope and believe that they are now more widely shared, and I find them more widely shared in what I have read from the context that we are now in. Can I apologize at this point for any mispronunciations of names which I am now bound to be guilty of? I'd like to thank Monishita Pandey for her attempts to get my pronunciation as close as it should be. No, as close as it can be. We know well enough, for instance, from Kumaravati Velu, 2006, how the historical British-US-American succession in terms of massive economic, military, and cultural influence on world affairs has resulted in the current importance of English language. We know well enough that the driving purpose of globalism is to allow money to move freely around the world to where it can find its biggest margins of profit, and then to move on when the time is right, leaving behind what it can no longer use. We know full well that such dominance and such carefree profit depend on the teaching of English, and that is how we make our livings. That is one perspective, at least. Another one responds that we teach English because that is what our people, and especially our young people, need if they are to get a good education, if they are to get good jobs, if they are to attain positions that will help them become a part of the decision makers. Not just improving the situation for themselves, but potentially for others too. This is the discourse of empowerment, and empowerment through English. So which is it? English for continuing domination, or English for empowerment? As usual, when either/or questions are posed, the answer is both. And that's what brings me on to the topic and the concept of hegemony, which is also variously pronounced. But this is what I understand to be the inescapable paradox of hegemony. That's to say, it is the kind of power that invites you to support it, because you and yours, we and ours, and those we care about can so clearly be helped, encouraged, and yes, empowered by taking advantage of the very power structures that are in place. And so, on a daily basis, we act to support a power structure of which, in principle, we might disapprove. I say the inescapable paradox of hegemony because that is how I see it. But that is not to say that we do not have choices. Indeed, as teaching is not simply a way of providing global capital with the workforce that it needs in order to make its profits, as teaching is also a values-based commitment to moral and ethical activity. Being clear about what choices we do have is an essential part of teaching and teacher education. Given a commitment to democracy, we might say, we cannot choose to ignore massive public demand for English. Equally, we have an ethical imperative not to follow educational policies that serve only to advantage those people already advantaged by the status quo. In my own country, for example, I would argue that educational and other policies are in place and currently being introduced, which clearly serve to advantage the advantaged and support that status quo. Few of us, I believe, would care to be the target of Parakrama's 1995 accusation from Sri Lanka that, in laying the blame elsewhere or saying in the appropriately subdued tone, "What else can we do?" the language teacher is pimping with a vengeance for the system while masturbating his or her conscience with this empowerment crap. Moving along quickly, these issues of social justice and of multilingual realities, it seemed to me, are ones, sorry, things just happened in front of me here, are things that we also need to be addressing and clearly have been addressed in the context in which we now are. I refer you to the sources on the screen. Clearly, it is not my role. It would be presumptuous of me to try to describe to you what the situation is in India, and I have no intention of trying to do so. What I will try to do is to hold up a small mirror of what things look like to an outsider, to a foreigner such as myself, who has no experience of living and working here, but has only been able to read some of the literature written here. And I offer you this perspective so that you can know what other people are thinking and see to what extent you find it appropriate for people to be thinking in that way. For example, we know well enough how the language learning experiences and theories of monolingual speakers of English have historically dominated the academic understanding of language acquisition. We know well enough, for instance from Meghanatan 2011, that India is a massively multilingual country, multilingual in terms of its communities, multilingual in terms of the individual lives of its citizens. And over recent years, research and scholarship that regard social justice as a core element of educational purpose and that see multilingualism as a natural human resource and not an aberrant problem, have provided the basis for a number of well-grounded analyses and proposals. In terms of social justice, for example, from Meghanatan 2011, English in India today is a symbol of people's aspirations for quality in education and fuller participation in national and international life. However, the disparity in the quality of English language education experienced by children further intensifies the already existing divide between English language rich and English language poor children. With regard to multilingual realities, and approach to language teaching. From Rao, 2013. Decades of work confirms that learning is most effective when a child has 8 to 10 years of good teaching through the medium of the mother tongue, accompanied by a gradual introduction of other languages, first as subjects, then partly also as teaching languages. This ensures a solid cognitive foundation for learning non-language subjects. It allows acquisition of other languages while retaining and developing the mother tongue. And it results in better learning of other languages when compared to non-mother tongue teaching models. Specific suggestions regarding the teacher's multilingual potential have also been developed, such as the findings of the study show that even when the teacher was not a speaker of the children's L1, she was a learner of that language. Her sensitivity towards the children's language, allowing freedom of usage of that language in class, had a positive impact on the learning of English, from Agarwal, 2013. And on Friday at the conference here, I was lucky enough to attend a session by Nandina Prakash and Savita Premachandra, who exemplified a multilingual approach to the teaching of English. And the quote on the screen now, notice, is not a question of giving permission to the teacher to use the native language if all else fails. It is a celebration of a multilingual reality in which the children actually live. If one stops for a moment and imagines a world in which language acquisition theory and language teaching theory had been developed in India, I can imagine a world in which specialists from India tour Britain and tour the United States, speaking to this deprived monolingual world and explaining that you can't really be a good language teacher unless you are fluent in at least 3 languages. And I can imagine the language teachers of Britain and the United States saying, how can we apply this to our situation? And it seems so transparently obvious that a multilingual reality needs a multilingual approach to language teaching. These ideas are now also at work in teacher education. I'm quoting here from work by Nivedita Bedadur, who also gave a presentation at this conference yesterday, exemplifying the principles of co-development. She wrote earlier, "The vast canvas of regional languages and dialectic variations poses many challenges. The burden of incomprehension, the lack of access and materials, and a history of immersion approaches loom large on the historical horizon of multilingual pedagogy. Yet, experiments on a small scale tell the story of a culturally viable pedagogy which needs to be developed if we want to have equal access to English education in marginalized areas." Looking back across the story of my own professional development and looking forward towards areas where I shall not be going, it seems to me now that perhaps the challenges that I never properly took on concerned the need to marry my preference for experiments on a small scale with the socio-political challenges of a located teacher education that emphasize the need for social justice as well as the development of the individual. So, as I always encourage myself to ask, so what, Julian? What is to be done? At least, it seems to me, and for a beginning, I would want to suggest that these socio-political issues are seen as core elements in a teacher education syllabus. Teachers, of course, then have the right to engage with the dilemmas involved if they so choose. But teacher educators, I would suggest, do not have the right to leave future generations of teachers uninformed about these socio-political dilemmas. If the graduating class of 2030 or 2040 starts to ask, why did we kill off our indigenous languages? Why didn't we recognize that interactions among early language use, cognitive development, and education are there? Why did we prioritize increasing opportunities for the wealthy over social mobility and social justice? Wasn't it clear that those societies that had smaller gaps between rich and poor were also more stable, less violent, less prone to drug abuse and other miseries? Wasn't it obvious that globalization meant the global freedom of money to move around to where it could make most profit and then move on when profits fell, taking its jobs and its promises with it? In the face of such questions, neither teachers nor teacher educators will have the luxury of falling back on what I think of as the Nixon defense, which was, if I did it, it must be correct. Because that sense of specious authority will have been blown away. Nor the Reagan defense of, I don't recall, because the data will be available. Nor the Blair defense of, oh, well, actually, it was quite a simple choice. Because the choices are far from simple. They might be able to rely on the Eichmann defense of, I was just following instructions. But only if teacher educators settle for that, giving teachers instructions on what to do, instructions on how to teach English, or even on how to become reflective practitioners, or how to become researchers, without consideration of the larger social, moral, and ethical context in which that work is done. Of course, I am an old, male, Anglo-Saxon, UK-based, native speaker of British English. And those advantages have served me well over the years. When I talk of hegemony and advise distrust of foreign experts, you might see me as pretty much the same as the legendary Cretan who said, "Don't believe Cretans, they're all liars." I am more or less condemned out of my own mouth. But then, I can't undo what I am, or change my story, or what I have to offer. I have come to understand better a Bob Dylan song from 1964, in which he sings of, "Fearing not, I become my enemy in the instant that I preach. Despite which, I come in peace." I'd like to add acknowledgements to Alistair Pennycook and Robert Phillipson for their typically generous response to my request for suggestions on what to read before attending this conference, as well as for their own groundbreaking contributions to work in areas on which I have only touched. And at that stage, I'd like to say thank you and hand back to Steve.
No. No, it's okay. What's the most important thing that we can tell our teachers? I think one of the most important things is to start on time and end on time. So I'm not going to take up very much of your time because I think otherwise the session will run over a little bit. But I think we should learn from experience. What have I learnt today? It's a reminder not to rely so much on technology. And I went to the ELT debate, and I think when I listened to that, I think I was on the side of Nikki and Atanu. But after today, I think I may be veering more to Gita and George in the question of whether technology sometimes gets in the way of communication. It's not a black and white thing. We need to get these balances right. And for me, as for you, we need to reflect on the most appropriate way to use technology and tools for ourselves in practicing what we preach, and for the teachers for the next generation. So, in terms of practicing what I preach, I'm going to not put any more PowerPoints on now, but to say I hope some of you will come along to the question and answer session where we will answer your questions, or perhaps you'll give us some answers to your questions. So, no point in putting your hand up. We will do question and answers later in the day. Thank you very much for listening. And once again, thanks to the British Council and to EFL-U for inviting us to this wonderful conference. It's my first visit to India, and I hope it won't be my last. Thank you.